So welcome to everybody. Today's session is going to take you through a bit of a refresh around the mental health crisis breathing space. And the plan is to kind of go through the slide deck and then give you plenty of opportunity for any questions that you might have. So if you could submit any questions that you do have into the chat for that session at the end of the presentation. So welcome. My name's Rebecca Clake. I am the compliance officer looking after the mental health crisis breathing space at We Are Group. So as I said, want to kind of give you a little bit of a refresh. For those of you who've been to one of our sessions before, you may well recognise some of the slides. Hopefully this will give you a kind of a refresh on that knowledge. And for anybody new, this should give you a basic understanding of the mental health crisis breathing space. So in terms of what it is, so there are essentially two types of breathing space underneath the debt respite regulations. So you have the standard breathing space, which is a statutory debt respite scheme that came into place back in 2021. So we've just had the anniversary for that. It basically provides up to 60 days protection for most creditor action for people who have a qualifying debt in England and Wales. There is a second breathing space, which is the mental health crisis breathing space. And this one is different. So this is a statutory scheme that offers the same protections, but for an unlimited time frame. So as long as the individual is receiving that qualifying mental health crisis treatment, they are able to be in the breathing space. So the eligibility for the mental health crisis breathing spaces is that they are living in England or Wales, that they are receiving qualifying mental health crisis treatment, and they have at least one problem debt. So just to kind of cover off what that qualifying treatment is then. So essentially the nice and easy straightforward ones are that either the individual has been detained in hospital underneath the Mental Health Act, or they've been taken to a place of safety underneath the Mental Health Act. The debt respite regulations also cover this specialist mental health service. So that is where potentially the individual isn't detained or hasn't been taken to a place of safety, but they are under the care of either a crisis home treatment team, a liaison mental health team, a community mental health team, or any other specialist mental health crisis service. I think the key thing around this crisis treatment is that this is where the individual is really truly in crisis, and once they kind of come out of their crisis and then they carry on into and have a long-term action plan, that would mean that underneath the rules of the regulations, they would not normally be considered in crisis, even if they were still being treated by a community mental health team potentially. So how does the scheme help? So essentially what it does is pause most creditor action whilst they're receiving that mental health crisis treatment. So it temporarily pauses most debt collection and enforcement actions. It also freezes interest and fees on qualifying debts, and it gives them access to free debt advice. And I think that's potentially one of the most important parts of this scheme, is enabling that debt advice. The debt advice itself is accredited by the Financial Conduct Authority, and it essentially is there to help people manage their money post-crisis treatment. I think one of the key things, though, to make sure that people understand is that the mental health crisis breathing space is not a payment holiday. So if an individual has debts and they are expected to be paying, so for example, mortgage payments, those payments still need to go ahead. It's just the interest and fees that are linked to the debts that is frozen during the time that they are in a breathing space. So in terms of who can actually submit an application, there are limitations underneath the regulations. So the individual themselves can submit an application. However, we always, if we speak to an individual about the scheme, point them in the direction of a mental health professional, purely because the information required on the form is very difficult to get if you don't understand the system, the schemes, etc. A carer who's receiving carer's allowance can also make an application. Their care coordinator can, an independent mental health advocate or mental capacity advocate can, their representative through power of attorney or court protection, an approved mental health professional, mental health nurses, or social workers. So those are the groups who can make an application. Now, under the scheme, there are two key roles. So I'm going to tackle the approved mental health professional role first. So the AMP is essentially most likely to be involved in the assessment of the individual to make that decision to treat underneath the Mental Health Act or enter into crisis treatment, or they would be working with the crisis treatment teams and asked to assess a patient's case notes to determine whether or not they believe that they are receiving that eligible treatment. The AMP's role is to make sure that they screen all of the applications in terms of whether or not that treatment the individual is receiving is qualifying, and they make the decision and put their signature on the application form. So every application has to be signed by a certificated AMP. The other element is that making sure that where the conversation has taken place between an AMP and the person who's making the referral is to check that the consent has been given to share the data that's included on the application process with the patient. Now, where that's not possible, you can do and complete an application and sign off an application underneath your best interest assessment. The nominated point of contact then has the ongoing role. So once the patient has been entered into the mental health crisis breathing space, this role of the nominated point of contact is really important to the continuation of that breathing space. So there's only certain roles that are eligible. And again, this is driven by the regulations. So the only roles that can be and hold that role of nominated point of contact is an AMP, a mental health nurse, or a care coordinator. And essentially, the MPOC should be involved in the day-to-day care of the individual, because every 20 to 30 days, they will receive an email from ourselves that asks whether or not that person is still receiving the qualifying crisis treatment. And if it's the MPOC that is completing the application in the first place, they need to have that conversation with the patient where possible to explain the scheme and to get their consent to send the information over. So in terms of making an application, so there's two ways. For those of you who want to do a really super quick, simple way, and you have access to a device, then there is our online portal. All you need to do is head over to mhcbs.co.uk to get started. And essentially, I'll show you a few more slides in terms of what the screen looks like. We do still accept manual forms to be emailed through. So if you don't have access to a portal for any reason, then you can still complete the form. It just means that you have to get the AMP signature on the form before you can email it to us, which makes it a little bit more tricky for you. In terms of the application portal, so that's a screenshot of the portal as it stands. Within here, there's loads and loads of information as well. But essentially what you would do is click on the apply for MHCBS. Now, if you've already got yourself logged in, then every time you want to submit a new application, you just click on apply and then it will remember you in terms of your role once you've logged in. If you're starting for the first time and you've never used the portal before, then just click on the apply and it will take you through the steps to get yourself set up. So as I say, you identify the patient is in crisis treatment and they have a problem debt. So the patient or one of those approved roles will fill the online application. That application then, if you're using the portal, gets sent immediately through to the AMP via email. They can then check all the records your end to make sure that they are receiving a crisis treatment if there's not been a conversation already. And then they can put their signature onto the form, and that automatically come straight back to us instantly. We then assess the application to make sure that all of the criteria has been met, and then if the individual is eligible, they will enter into the breathing space moratorium, which is what puts the protections in place. If they're not eligible, then the process will end, and whoever has submitted the application will receive a notification to say they've not been successful. As I said, there is an awful lot of information available to you, not just about how to complete the application form, but also loads of different articles around different debt problems, different roles, lots of different bits and pieces. There's also the regulations in there. If anybody is really geeky like me who likes to read these kind of things, then you can read those bits and pieces. Those QR scans, codes on the screen there will help you to get that. So there's different ways that you can access it, but there is a huge amount of information available in there. So our helpline and emails are manned Monday to Friday, 9 till 5. So if you have any questions outside of those, this is where I would direct you to find, because there's so much information in there that might be able to help any queries that you have outside of those hours. We do regular events like this one, so to kind of raise awareness of the scheme, but also to give you a little bit of understanding around different parts of the scheme. So the next one coming up is with Raluca, who's going to go through what debt advice is and what wider support there is available that we can help individuals with who are on the mental health crisis breathing space. And at that point, I will move over to question and answers and stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for joining our MHCBS presentation today. We hope you found the practical refresh helpful. We do now have about 15 minutes or so to answer some of your questions. So if you haven't done so already, please get them in the chat and we'll have plenty of time to hopefully get those answered. We have had a couple of questions in the chat. Tom, I think you have sent a really interesting one, and Raluca has actually kindly answered it in the chat already. If you do have any follow-up questions to anything Raluca has said, please do get it in the chat and we'll do our best to answer. We have had a question also from another Tom, and unfortunately he missed the first few minutes of the presentation. So I was just wondering, Rebecca, if you could go over the part that defines the crisis in the MHCBS, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the qualifying crisis treatment is where an individual has been potentially detained underneath the Mental Health Act, or moved to a place of safety underneath the Mental Health Act. They're the two nice, clear, simple ones. There is then this wider piece around crisis treatment in potentially a community setting, because not everybody is going to be detained in hospital, whether that's voluntarily or detained, sorry, that should be clear. But essentially, if the individual is receiving crisis treatment from a crisis home treatment team or a liaison team, or those kind of areas where the individual is clearly in crisis, so they're really struggling. Once they move out of this kind of peak period where there is real crisis in place and they move towards a longer term treatment plan, that's when we look at saying that they're no longer receiving that crisis treatment in a community setting. So the nice clear-cut ones are that they've been detained in hospital, they've then been released, and they've been handed over to community team. So it depends on then whether or not the community treatment team are still part of the crisis home treatment team that they've been referred to, or if it's just normal mental health community treatment, that wouldn't necessarily qualify as crisis treatment. So it is a very grey area. When the application is being made, it is completely the AMP's decision. So it's not something that we would question. So if we receive an application that has been signed by a certificated AMP, then essentially that is what we will take as long as we've got the right signatures and the right people on the form kind of thing, and that there is this qualifying debt.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. We've actually had a follow-up from Tom in relation to Raluca's response. So Raluca, I don't know if you would be able to answer what Tom has posted in the chat. So he's just asking about what he wants to clarify is that if the doctor feels that the person is now stable, are they allowed to lift the breathing space? Or do they automatically have to remain on it because they remain detained under the Mental Health Act?
I think that's a bit outside of the remit and my knowledge. So I think it's for the medical professionals to establish if the type of crisis treatment or the type of treatment the client or the patient receives meets the conditions set by the regulations. Do you have anything to add, Rebecca, on that one?
I was just going to say, so normally if the doctor is working with the nominated point of contact, so it's going to be working with the mental health nurse or the care coordinator, they are the only people that would notify us or receive the notifications in terms of the interval checks that we have to do every 20 to 30 days. So the doctor should talk and communicate with that individual who is going to have to respond to say, yes, they're in qualifying treatment or not. And that MPOC should work with the doctors who are making the assessments as well. So
yeah. So it's a professional medical assessment.
Yes.
And outside of the remit of that advice and the scheme.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. We've got a question as well from Tracy. She's asked specifically about the application stage, I think. So she said, if a mental health nurse, for example, refers via the portal, how does it then get to the AMP to sign, or are they contacted first?
No.
So just a little bit of clarity about that would be great, Rebecca.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we would definitely say that we are advocates for picking up the phone and talking to the AMP and the AMP service before, because what the application requires is a named AMP and their contact details to be entered into the application form, which is then how they receive the form to make the signatory. So unless you are specifically already working with the AMP, it's best to pick up the phone, speak to the AMP service, speak to the duty AMP, get the details in terms of what name to put down and their email address to fill in the form so that it goes straight through to them. They can then have a look at the form and put the signatory on, kind of thing. So the portal process doesn't remove the need to have a conversation potentially, because you might not know the right name to put in. If you do, then great, it's even quicker, kind of thing. But yeah, that's how the AMP knows and gets the application is that they must have their details submitted as part of the application process.
Brilliant, thank you. We've also had a question from Marcus, which is similar. You may have just answered it a little bit there. So he's asked, what happens if your service doesn't have an AMP, but they have nurses and care coordinators to sign papers?
So unfortunately, they can't sign the application. So they will take on the roles of the nominated point of contact, absolutely, and because they're going to be the person that's working with them on a day-to-day basis. So it is about reaching out to the local authority and the AMP service. So every local authority must have an AMP service that is provisioned 24/7. So it's about contacting the AMP service to make that referral for the application and for them to then make the decision in terms of that.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. I think that we have answered all the questions that have been posted in the chat. So if you do have a few more, please get them in. In the meantime, as we do have about 8-9 minutes or so, I'll just ask Raluca some frequently asked questions about the debt advice provision. So Raluca, is it possible if you could just answer the question, if the client is too unwell to engage with the debt advice sessions, would the protections of the scheme still be activated?
If they can or cannot, sorry.
So if the client is too unwell to engage with the debt advice, are the protections of the scheme still activated?
Thank you. So unlike standard breathing space, the one that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, There's no requirement for clients to engage with that advice when they are in mental health crisis breathing space. So we offer that advice to clients in mental health crisis breathing space, but it's not an obligation. They do not have to take it on if they're unwell and can't deal with it. But we do recommend it, especially at the end of their crisis treatment, because it will assist them in resolving their indebtedness, and ultimately that affects how they feel. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Aluka. I think back to you, Rebecca, if you could potentially answer this question. I think there's a bit of confusion still about the AMP's involvement. So Peter's just asked, why would the AMP be involved if they're not actively involved in the case?
Yeah, so this is one of the pieces around the regulations. So when they put the regulations together, they decided that the AMP was the best placed individual based on their level of expertise of legal requirements to make the decisions. So whilst they may not be involved in the individual's case, although in some circumstances they are, they are still underneath the regulations the best placed person to make a decision on what meets the criteria for qualifying crisis treatment. It's such a grey area. It is very, very subjective, but that's the responsibility of the AMP. So it takes it away from the person who's dealing with the individual directly.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. I hope that has answered the question there, Peter. For anybody else who might be a little bit confused, we do have a really comprehensive content library, and we have put on these webinars since last year. So it may well be that your question is in our frequently asked questions sheet, and there'll be a proper or more lengthy potentially response in the FAQ sheet. Let's have a look at the chat to see if there's any more questions. So we've got a question from Dawn, and that's, how soon after someone is put into the breathing space should they be contacted by your team?
So as an individual is entered into the breathing space, the individual will be notified if you have provided their email address and their mobile number as part of the application process, then we can communicate to the individual directly. And they will receive a very short notice that says you've been entered. They will also then, within probably about 2 to 3 days, receive a further letter which fully details all of the kind of elements of the scheme. It will also, if there is anything that hasn't been included in terms of the debts, give them guidance on, oh, have you got any of these debts? So, for example, they may not have spoken about rent arrears, or they might have a county court judgment against them that we would need to find out more information. So they will receive something that says, this is what's happening and these are any further steps that you need to take. The person who also holds the role of the nominated point of contact will also receive a copy of that letter, purely because not everybody is going to be able to act on it. So if a person is in crisis, they may not be and have the capacity to act on it. So that's why we also send it to the nominated point of contact, who may well then be working with the individual or with the individual's power of attorney to deal with it. At any point, essentially, if an individual wants to engage in debt advice and they're ready, then the nominated point of contact just needs to reach out to us to get that arranged. Easiest way to do that is to drop us an email at support@mhcbs.co.uk. So if you have any clients who are on the breathing space at the moment, and they're ready to engage in debt advice, then please drop us a quick note and we will get that organised with our partners who deliver that debt advice piece.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. We have had another question from Tom about the eligibility for breathing space and their understanding of kind of an acute crisis or the acute care, which is obviously they're being detained for. Would you be able to provide a bit more clarity on how kind of immediate that crisis or the acute care needs to be? Because I think he's under the impression that They may have been detained under the Mental Health Act a long time ago, but it might be subjective as to whether they still need care and therefore eligible for the MHCBS.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is the decision of initially when the application is submitted, it's the AMP that makes the call around whether or not that acute crisis is happening. If that individual is then detained for a longer period underneath Section 3 of the Mental Health Act, then or any other element, then it is the nominated point of contact that makes the decision. Now, they may well be working with doctors, psychiatrists, clinical physicians, all those kind of different roles. They will make a joint decision at the regular conversations that they have working together as a team kind of thing. And then it's down to the nominated point of contact to update us when we send those interval checks every 20 to 30 days. If they need further guidance, then they can contact us. We do have an AMP that works with us on our service. So they may be able to speak to the AMP that we work with, who potentially could give further guidance if anybody has any queries around that. So I think that the key thing is around, if somebody's detained for a long period of time, then yes, they're probably likely to still be in that acute crisis. If somebody's been detained and then discharged to a community treatment team, that's where there's a little bit more of a grey area that potentially would not necessarily constitute acute crisis treatment. So that's the decision to be made by the mental health professionals who are holding that nominated point of contact role.
Perfect. Thank you so much to Rebecca and Raluca for answering those really interesting questions.